April 12, 1961. The alarm goes off at 5:30 in the morning. Outside, it's still dark at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. 27-year-old Yuri Gagarin sits up, eats breakfast, and climbs into a bright orange spacesuit. By 7 in the morning, he's strapped inside a metal sphere barely wider than a beach ball. The capsule sits atop a rocket that was originally designed to deliver nuclear warheads. Now, it's about to deliver something else entirely, something the world has never seen. At 9:07 Moscow time, the engines ignite. Gagarin feels the rumble beneath him as the R-7 rocket lifts off. He radios back to Earth with a single word. Off we go. 108 minutes later, he'll be back on the ground. But nothing will ever be the same. The Soviet Union has just put the first human being into space, orbiting the entire planet while America watches from below. The space race has a new scorecard, and the United States is losing. 8 years and 3 months later, on a July evening in 1969, 2 Americans will plant a flag on the surface of the moon. How did the United States go from trailing behind to achieving what seemed impossible? This is the story of the most dramatic technological competition in human history. The space race didn't start in space. It started in the ruins of Nazi Germany. When World War II ended in 1945, American and Soviet soldiers raced through German territory, looking for the same prize. Not gold or territory, but rocket scientists. The Germans had developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Both superpowers wanted that technology, and they wanted the men who built it. The Americans got Wernher von Braun and his team through a program called Operation Paperclip. The Soviets captured their own group of German engineers and brought them east. Both sides had the same goal: build rockets powerful enough to carry nuclear weapons across continents. Space was just the arena where this military technology would be tested in front of the whole world. By the mid-50s, tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States had frozen into what everyone called the Cold War. Both nations possessed nuclear weapons. Both had developed intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching each other's territory. The arms race was terrifying, but it was mostly invisible to ordinary citizens. Then came October 4, 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 into orbit around Earth. It was a simple metal sphere about the size of a beach ball, weighing less than 200 pounds. It didn't do much except transmit a radio beep. But that beep changed everything. Americans looked up at the night sky with a new kind of fear. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere in the United States. The technology was the same. The missile gap, as newspapers started calling it, suddenly seemed very real. President Dwight Eisenhower tried to calm the public, but the panic had already set in. Congress demanded action. Within months, America launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, on January 31, 1958. By July of that same year, Eisenhower had signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA. The race was officially on. But the Soviets weren't waiting around. Less than a month after Sputnik 1, they launched Sputnik 2. This one carried a passenger. A dog named Laika became the first living creature sent into orbit. The mission was designed to be one way. Laika died shortly after launch, likely from stress and overheating, but the message was clear. If the Soviets could keep a dog alive in space, even briefly, they could eventually send a human. Behind the scenes, a brilliant Soviet engineer named Sergei Korolev was orchestrating these achievements. The Soviet government kept his identity secret, referring to him only as the chief designer. Korolev had survived Stalin's prison camps and emerged with an obsession. He wanted to send humans to space and eventually to the moon. By early 1961, Korolev's team had developed the Vostok program. They'd tested the spacecraft with mannequins and animals. Everything was ready for a human pilot. The Soviet leadership wanted another first, another propaganda victory over the Americans. They selected 20 pilots for the cosmonaut program. The candidates went through grueling physical and psychological tests. They were spun in centrifuges, locked in isolation chambers, subjected to temperature extremes. The Vostok capsule was tiny, so the Soviets looked for pilots who were short and physically fit. Yuri Gagarin stood out from the beginning. He was 5 feet 5 inches tall, perfect for the cramped capsule. He'd grown up on a collective farm, survived the Nazi occupation as a child, and excelled as a fighter pilot. He was smart, calm under pressure, and most importantly, he was Russian. In the Soviet system, that mattered. On April 12, 1961, Gagarin was strapped into Vostok 1. The spacecraft consisted of a spherical re-entry module and an equipment section containing the rocket engines. The entire vehicle weighed nearly 5 tons. At launch, Gagarin's heart rate climbed to 150 beats per minute. Then he was in the air. The flight was almost entirely automated. Gagarin had a manual override code locked in an envelope, just in case the automatic systems failed. His commanders had already told him the code anyway, just to be safe. For 108 minutes, he orbited Earth at speeds reaching 17,000 miles per hour. During re-entry, things got rough. The equipment module didn't separate cleanly from the capsule. Gagarin spun violently, experiencing 8 times the force of gravity. His training as a fighter pilot saved him. He stayed conscious while the connecting wires finally burned through and his capsule stabilized. At about 23,000 feet, Gagarin ejected from the capsule and parachuted separately to the ground. He landed in a field near the town of Engels. A farmer and her daughter watched this strange figure in an orange suit drift down from the sky. Gagarin called out to them, explaining he was a Soviet citizen who'd just returned from space. They thought he was joking at first. The news hit America like a punch to the gut. The Soviets had done it again. First satellite, first living creature in orbit, and now first human in space. The United States was 3 weeks away from launching its first astronaut, Alan Shepard, on a suborbital flight that wouldn't even reach orbit. President John F. Kennedy, who'd been in office for less than 3 months, held an emergency meeting. The pressure was enormous. The Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba had just failed spectacularly. American prestige was at an all-time low. Kennedy needed a win, something big enough to shift the momentum. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard finally flew. His Mercury capsule, Freedom 7, reached space but didn't orbit the Earth. It was a suborbital hop lasting just 15 minutes. Compared to Gagarin's orbital flight, it seemed almost embarrassing. But Shepard's safe return gave Kennedy a glimmer of hope. 20 days later, Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress. He'd consulted with Vice President Lyndon Johnson, NASA Administrator James Webb, and his advisors. They needed a goal that was achievable but dramatic. Something the Soviets hadn't done yet. Something that would capture the world's imagination. Kennedy's speech covered many urgent national needs, from foreign aid to civil defense. But near the end, he made a declaration that would define a decade. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. The room erupted in applause, but not everyone was convinced. Critics argued it was too expensive, too risky, too politically motivated. They were right on all counts. The Apollo program would eventually cost $24 billion, equivalent to roughly $100 billion in today's money. It would employ nearly 400,000 people. Only the construction of the Panama Canal and the Manhattan Project compared in scope. But Kennedy understood something crucial. The moon was achievable. The Soviets had a head start in space, but they didn't have a head start on the moon. Nobody had been there. It was a race that could be won with enough money, enough talent, and enough national will. More importantly, it was a race the Soviets might not be able to match. NASA went to work immediately. Project Mercury would continue with orbital flights to gain experience. Project Gemini would test the techniques needed for lunar missions, including spacewalks and orbital rendezvous. And Project Apollo would build the massive spacecraft and rocket systems needed to actually reach the moon. The Soviets, meanwhile, kept racking up firsts. In August 1961, German Titov orbited Earth 17 times over more than 25 hours. In June 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. In March 1965, Alexei Leonov performed the first spacewalk. But behind the scenes, the Soviet lunar program was struggling. Korolev was brilliant, but he didn't have the resources NASA had. The Soviet government was funding multiple competing design bureaus, creating inefficiency. While NASA had a single clear goal and nearly unlimited funding, the Soviets were divided and underfunded. Their N-1 rocket, designed to match America's Saturn V, kept failing in tests. NASA's answer to the moon challenge was the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built. It stood 363 feet tall and weighed over 6 million pounds when fully fueled. The first stage alone had 5 engines producing a combined 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Werner von Braun led the design at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Everything about the Saturn V was extreme. The fuel tanks were so large they had to be built in new facilities. The engines were so powerful that NASA built special test stands just to fire them. Every component had to work perfectly because there was no room for error. The spacecraft sitting atop the Saturn V was equally complex. The Apollo Command Module would house 3 astronauts during flight. The service module contained fuel, oxygen, and the main engine. The lunar module, a strange-looking craft with spindly legs, would actually land on the moon. It had been designed by a team at Grumman Aircraft who'd never built a spacecraft before. Testing was relentless. Engineers fired engines until they exploded, just to find the limits. Astronauts trained in simulators that replicated every possible failure scenario. Everyone knew that small mistakes in space meant death. The program lost ground when a fire during a launch rehearsal killed 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, in January 1967. NASA halted flights for over a year, redesigning the command module from scratch. But by late 1968, they were ready to try again. Apollo 7 tested the command module in Earth orbit. Then, in December 1968, Apollo 8 did something remarkable. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first humans to leave Earth's orbit, travel to the moon, orbit it 10 times, and return home. They broadcast a Christmas Eve message from lunar orbit that was watched by over 1 billion people worldwide. Apollo 9 and Apollo 10 tested more systems in Earth orbit and lunar orbit. By the summer of 1969, NASA was ready for the landing attempt. The crew was selected carefully. Neil Armstrong, the commander, was a civilian test pilot known for his cool demeanor under pressure. Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, held a doctorate in astronautics and had trained extensively for the mission. Michael Collins, the command module pilot, would remain in lunar orbit while his crewmates descended to the surface. July 16, 1969, 9:32 in the morning Eastern Time. Over 1 million people gathered near the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Vice President Spiro Agnew and former President Lyndon Johnson watched from the VIP stands. Across the world, hundreds of millions tuned in to television broadcasts. The Saturn V ignited. The ground shook for miles. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins felt the rocket push them skyward with 5 Gs of force. 11 minutes later, they were in Earth orbit. 2.5 hours after that, the third stage reignited, accelerating them to over 24,000 miles per hour. They were on their way to the moon. The journey took 3 days. The astronauts separated the command module from the rocket stage, turned around, and docked with the lunar module that had been stored below. They spent the time sleeping, eating, checking systems, and marveling at the view of Earth shrinking behind them. On July 19th, they fired their engine to slow down and enter lunar orbit. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin crawled through the docking tunnel into the lunar module, Eagle. Collins remained behind in Columbia, the command module. At 1 in the afternoon Houston time, Eagle separated and began its descent. The landing was supposed to be automatic, guided by computer. But as they descended, alarms started blaring. The computer was overloaded, trying to process too much information. Armstrong had to make a split-second decision: trust the computer or take manual control. He chose to keep going. Then he looked out the window and saw where they were headed. The computer was guiding them straight toward a crater filled with car-sized boulders. There was no way they could land safely there. Armstrong took manual control, flew over the crater, and searched for a better spot. Fuel was running low. Mission Control watched the numbers drop. 30 seconds of fuel left. 20. 10. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Houston time, Eagle's landing probes touched the lunar surface. Armstrong radioed back 5 words. The Eagle has landed. Back in Houston, the Mission Control Room erupted in celebration. But Armstrong and Aldrin had work to do. They went through post-landing checklists, checked systems, prepared for the moonwalk. 6.5 hours after landing, Armstrong opened the hatch. At 10:56 in the evening Houston time, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong descended the ladder and stepped onto the lunar surface. An estimated 650 million people worldwide watched on television. Armstrong spoke into his microphone. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joined him on the surface. Together, they spent 2.5 hours outside. They planted an American flag, collected rocks and soil samples, set up scientific experiments, spoke with President Richard Nixon via radio, and described everything they saw for the scientists back on Earth. The moon's surface was dusty, gray, covered in small craters. In the distance, rolling hills marked the edge of the Sea of Tranquility. Above them, Earth hung in the black sky, a blue and white marble suspended in darkness. Aldrin looked around at the desolate landscape and said 2 words:
magnificent desolation.
After returning to the lunar module, they tried to sleep. The cabin was cold, dropping to 61 degrees. They slept fitfully. Armstrong perched on an improvised hammock. Aldrin on the floor in his spacesuit. At 1:54 in the afternoon the next day, they fired the ascent engine and lifted off from the moon. 3.5 hours later, they docked with Collins in the command module. The lunar module was jettisoned, left to crash into the moon's surface. On July 24th, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts spent 21 days in quarantine, just in case they'd brought back any lunar germs. When they finally emerged, they were treated to parades, speeches, and worldwide celebration. The United States had won the space race. At least, that's how most Americans saw it. Kennedy's goal, set 8 years earlier, had been achieved with months to spare. The Soviet Union, which had led in nearly every category of space achievement up to that point, had been decisively beaten to the moon. But the story was more complex than simple victory. The Soviets made 4 failed attempts to launch their N-1 moon rocket between 1969 and 1972. One of these failures, in July 1969, just days before Apollo 11 launched, resulted in a massive explosion on the launch pad. The Soviet lunar program, underfunded and plagued by technical problems, never recovered. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer who'd masterminded the early Soviet successes, had died in 1966 during a routine surgery. Without his vision and leadership, the Soviet space program lost direction. The N-1 rocket was eventually canceled. The Soviets publicly claimed they'd never been racing to the moon at all, though documents revealed years later told a different story. For the United States, the moon landing was more than a technological achievement. It was a moment of national unity in a divided time. The country was torn by the Vietnam War, racial tensions, and political protests. But for one night in July, Americans came together to watch their countrymen walk on another world. The landing demonstrated American technological superiority in the starkest possible terms. The message was clear to allies and adversaries alike. If the United States could send humans to the moon and bring them back alive, imagine what else they could do. The Cold War continued for another 2 decades, but after Apollo 11, there was little doubt about which nation had the stronger technological base. 5 more Apollo missions successfully landed on the moon between 1969 and 1972. Apollo 13, in April 1970, suffered an explosion that nearly killed its crew, but demonstrated NASA's ability to improvise solutions under impossible pressure. The last mission, Apollo 17, in December 1972, landed geologist Harrison Schmitt and Commander Gene Cernan on the lunar surface. They were the last humans to walk on the moon. In July 1975, 6 years after the moon landing, American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit. The Apollo-Soyuz test project symbolized a thaw in Cold War relations. The handshake in space between American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts suggested that competition might give way to cooperation. But the moon landing's impact went far beyond politics. The technologies developed for Apollo filtered into everyday life. Integrated circuits, freeze-dried food, cordless tools, water purification systems, and countless other innovations trace their origins to the space program. The satellite communications we take for granted today began with systems tested during the space race. More importantly, Apollo changed how humanity saw itself. The photographs of Earth taken from the moon, showing our planet as a fragile blue sphere floating in darkness, sparked the modern environmental movement. For the first time, people could see their home as a single, unified world without borders. The space race also transformed American education. After Sputnik, schools emphasized science and mathematics in ways they never had before. Billions of dollars flowed into research universities. An entire generation of engineers and scientists was inspired to pursue careers in technology because of the moon landing. Today, when we talk about achieving impossible goals, we still reference the moon landing. If they could put a man on the moon, people say, suggesting that any challenge can be overcome with enough determination and resources. It's become shorthand for human achievement at its finest. Yuri Gagarin, the man who started it all, never made it back to space. In March 1968, he died in a plane crash during a routine training flight. He was 34 years old. Neil Armstrong lived until 2012, rarely giving interviews, uncomfortable with the celebrity his one small step had created. Both men were test pilots who happened to be at the right place at the right time. They became symbols of something larger than themselves. The space race was driven by fear, competition, and politics. 2 superpowers spent fortunes trying to prove their superiority, risking lives in the process. But it also represented something better about human nature, the desire to explore, the willingness to take enormous risks for knowledge, the dream of reaching beyond our limits. 8 years separated Gagarin's orbit from Armstrong's first steps on the moon. 8 years of intense work by hundreds of thousands of people. 8 years of failures and successes, tragedies and triumphs. In that brief window, humanity went from barely reaching space to walking on another world. The moon still hangs in our night sky, marked with flags and footprints that will last for thousands of years. No human has returned since 1972, but the dream hasn't died. New programs are taking shape, new nations are joining the effort, and someday humans will go back. When they do, they'll be following a path first cleared in the greatest decade of exploration humanity has ever known. The space race showed what we're capable of when we commit ourselves completely to a goal. It proved that the impossible is just the difficult that takes a little longer. And it reminded us that while the reasons we reach for the stars may change, the human impulse to explore never will. That's the real legacy of those 8 years. Not just the technology or the politics, but the proof that we can do extraordinary things when we dare to try.